What was the most statistically unlikely event you've ever witnessed? Story 1. I ran into my next-door neighbor in Vatican City. We lived in Virginia, and neither of us knew the other was even in Europe at the time. Story 2. I've said this on Reddit before, but for a college journalism class, I was assigned to write an obituary about one of my grandparents. All of my grandparents were alive, so I randomly chose my maternal grandfather. When I sat down to write it, I gave my mom a call and asked her for some basic biographical information about him. As we were talking about my grandpa's career, my mom couldn't recall the name of one of the companies he worked at. She lectured me about waiting until the last minute to write the assignment because it was late, 10:30 p.m. my grandpa's time. However, she said she would give him a call to see if he was still awake and be able to answer that question once my assignment was due the following morning. When my mom called my grandpa, my grandma answered the phone in a panic. My grandma frantically explained that the paramedics had just arrived and were performing CPR on my grandpa because he had stopped breathing and lost consciousness. My mom was able to stay on the phone with my grandma until they took my grandpa to the hospital, where he was declared dead. In the time my mom and I had been talking on the phone about my grandpa's obituary, he was dying. His death was entirely unexpected at that. Although he was in his 80s, he was the healthiest of my grandparents at the time. We ended up using the obituary I wrote for that writing assignment as his actual obituary. Still freaks me out when I think about improbable it was that A, I was in a class that wanted me to write an obituary about a living grandparent. B, I randomly chose my maternal grandfather out of my 4 grandparents who were all alive, and C, the very night I wrote it, he died. Without the writing assignment, my mom would have never called as late at night as she did, and as such was able to talk to my grandma in the midst of the horrible situation. Story 3. I'm an astronomer and was sitting in the backyard one summer evening chatting with a colleague. We were sharing our origin stories about what got us interested in astronomy. He described how, as a child, he was sitting in his backyard one evening and was fascinated by a bright meteor that streaked across the sky. As soon as he finished the sentence, a bright meteor streaked across the sky. Story 4. For about a year, I was convinced that I dropped a roll of masking tape into another dimension. I was in my garage, grabbing something from a cupboard, and I knocked the roll of masking tape out. I saw it hit the ground and roll, but when I turned around, it was gone. Both cars were parked in the garage, so I pulled them out, and the tape was nowhere, just gone. I even brought my wife out to help me look. I was haunted by this unexplained event until we moved house. What had apparently happened was the tape fell out of the cupboard, hit the ground, rolled 12 feet in a straight line under both cars, then through a gap between 2 cardboard boxes no wider than the tape itself, one det. I pulled a box out to load it on moving day, and there was the tape up against the wall. Story 5. Back in the days of landlines, I called my friend. The phone never rang, but I heard, "Hello?" It was him. He was calling me at the exact same time, and it connected us without either phone ringing. We did the exact same thing a month or so later. Asterisk. Damn. Guess it wasn't that weird at all. I'd never heard of it happening to anyone else until today, when apparently the rest of the entire world informed me that they've done the same thing. LOL. Story 6. I was a tour guide in a very remote, unvisited part of Alaska one summer, and a guy from Costa Rica took my tour. Probably the only person from Latin American I saw all summer. The next spring, I went to Costa Rica and took a tour of a butterfly colony. We were the only ones there. Seemed like they got very few visitors. The tour guide was the guy from who had taken my tour in Alaska. Story 7. Actually just mentioned it the other day in another post. I saw a car in the next lane over get rear-ended while I was talking about a car getting rear-ended. It was pretty weird. Story 8. My neighbor was installing a wireless keypad for her garage door opener. I was coming home, and at the exact moment she pushed the buttons to program it to her opener, I pushed my opener. So my opener then operated her garage door. Didn't know until the next day when I came home again and went to open my door and hers opened also. Story 9. A clown car accident. It was about 10 years ago in Northeast Ohio, at the corner of 87 and 44. A little old lady in a Camry had sent a tiny car off the road, and there was like 7 clowns milling about with one very confused-looking statey. Story 10. From another thread that asked the same question. I had a cousin who had lived in Los Angeles years ago and had a 323 phone number that I had saved in my phone. She moved and changed to her new area code and gave up the old phone number. Years later, I got a call from the same 323 number, and it popped up with my cousin's name on my phone. I never removed the 323 number from the contact. The The person who was calling me had no idea who I was or who my cousin was and didn't have the number in their contacts. She had accidentally misdialed someone completely unrelated and entered my number. Edit. To add, I wasn't even in the same area, so she had to have manually typed a 10-digit phone number wrong and entered mine. Story 11. Friends and I were hiking in Hawaii Volcano National Park when it erupted in 2021. The entire island swarmed to the park to see the lava flow. We had already gotten our cabin campsite set up, and it was a 10-minute walk from the viewing site. That night, the sky had this amazing orange glow. I knew at that moment that what I was seeing was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And I still didn't take a picture. I knew a photo with my phone wasn't going to do it justice, but damn still should have done it. Story 12. My brother and I were horsing around when we were kids and started throwing things at each other from across the room. At one point, I grabbed a pencil off my desk and threw it in his general direction. It missed him, but bounced off a table, a wall, and ended up on the floor standing straight up balanced on the eraser side of the pencil. Couldn't do that again if I tried 1,000,000 times. Story 13. This one happened to me a few years ago. I grew up in central Indiana. I was visiting Los Angeles and sitting at a bar. I started chatting with the stranger sitting next to me. Before too long, we realized that we both grew up in the same town in Indiana. Eventually, we came to realize that we both lived in the same bedroom of the same house in Indiana growing up. His family owned the home prior to mine. In fact, his dad was the builder. Our heads about exploded when we came to the realization while sitting at a bar on the other side of the country. Story 14. Something I witnessed and was involved in. Back in 1996, when I was 12 years old, I got into 2 car accidents in one day. My dad was driving me in his car and we rear-ended somebody broke down, without hazards on, going about 40 miles per hour. We weren't hurt, but the car was totaled. Then the tow truck that came to transport our car from the scene, we were in the cab of the truck, and drove away from the scene. Another car at the scene, held up by police traffic, ignored the police blockade and drove his station wagon right into the back of the flatbed tow truck we were in, decapitating him instantly. He was an elderly man that was coming home from a train show, and I just remember the police throwing all kinds of train collectibles out the back of his car because they didn't want the boxes to burn since the car caught fire. I remember being carried past the car, and they just had a sheet over a torso. It was completely devastating. My mother went to the man's funeral because my dad and I weren't able to handle it. Story 15. We were throwing cards into a box on top of a trash can on Halloween night, just drunk and having fun, and one of my cards bounced off the wall and stuck into the floor on the corner standing up. That card, the ace of spades. Everyone was dumbfounded and we left it there for like 15 minutes. Story 16. I bumped into my uncle in Philadelphia at the Liberty Bell. My brother was being married Virginia Beach, and my uncle RSVP'd that he couldn't attend. My wife and kids took a day trip up to Philadelphia like a day or two before the wedding, and we bumped into him and his family. He lived in Las Vegas at the time. Story 17. Saw 2 blind men crash into each other. One asked, "Can't you see I'm blind?" To which the other one answered laughing, "No, because I'm blind too." "Oh, I'm sorry," the other said. Then they kept walking as if nothing happened. Story 18. Answered restaurant reservations call with a guy who had the same name as I do at the same time. Very common first name and very distinct last name. Both of us had a table for 2 at 7 o'clock. It was rather uncanny when the hostess asked my last name, and I still confirmed with the other guy, looking puzzled why I thought she was calling for me. Story 19. This happened a few weeks ago. I live in NC now, but was born and raised in Maine. I ran into a guy from Maine down here visiting his son. We started chatting, and I mentioned working at an apple orchard as a kid that was owned by my friend's dad. He said it was wild because he did the same thing. The one he worked at was owned by his best friend's dad. It was the same guy. I'd moved after 7th grade and lost track of him. This guy moved in a few months after I'd left, and my old best friend and he became best friends. Our common friend inherited the orchard from his father and was still running it. Story 20. Bumped into a high school classmate outside of Buckingham Palace in London. He was on a run, just passing through for a couple seconds. My friend and I were taking pictures, only hung around there for 10 minutes. "We're from Southern California." Story 21. Oh, also one time I pulled into my driveway thinking, I feel like I need an oil change soon. When I checked my odometer, it was the exact number on my next oil change sticker, 171354. I started screaming, LOL. Story 22. I seen a car crash where the car flipped and landed wedged between 2 houses. The car was not wedged long ways either, so it looked like it was parked in the air between the 2 houses. Adding to that, I have no idea how it got so much air from that accident. It only hit sidewalk and bushes. Either way, you could try to recreate that thousands of times and not get a car perfectly wedged like that. Story 23. 42 years ago, when I was a student teacher in a high school, I asked, for the first time ever, a student to remain after class. She was not pleased and said she just wanted to get the fuck out of school and, "Can I go now?" I said sure. In 2019, I met a woman hiking in northern Idaho up on a mountain. We talked, made a date. We are now married. She is the student. Story 24. When I was a kid, I ran down a forest path, stumbled, and landed in a pile of coins. When I was an adult, I was cycling through the woods and got off my bike at one point because I saw some mushrooms. Dinner. Still standing next to my bike, I looked down and directly between my feet was an old coin, 18th century. Sadly, this habit of stumbling upon random money doesn't translate well to my everyday life. But maybe one day if I just follow the rainbow. Story 25. Many years ago, I rented a room just off of Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles. I did the ancestry search thing and found a screenshot of my great-grandfather's military card for the draft 100 years prior that he signed while traveling around the U.S. looking for land to buy because he lived in eastern Canada. We think he rode the trains all over the country and ended up in California. When he signed that card, the address he listed, I'm assuming for a hotel, motel, or rented room, was around the corner on Pico Boulevard about 500 feet away. Story 26. Plane crash. It was the Austin, Texas one, where a disgruntled failed businessman set his house on fire and then stole, a plane in Georgetown, Texas, and flew it into the IRS building, actually an office building the IRS rented space in. I worked nearby and happened to be outside taking out trash when he flew over us and hit the building. Story 27. My wife and I, East Coast Americans, were on holiday in Italy. We went deep into a non-touristy neighborhood to have dinner around 10 p.m. Heard no languages other than Italian. Some called out my name. It was a former barista from Baltimore who, after finishing uni, married and moved to Albania to work for an NGO. He and his wife were on a short holiday to Rome. He had seen me the day before in St. Peter's Square, but thought, no, that's not him. But when he saw my wife and I together, he spoke up. Story 28, mine has to do with Reddit in a way. I used to read the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit every night before bed, catching up on murder mysteries and updates. One night someone posted an article about how DNA caught a man who killed his wife with an axe in New York, back in the early 80s or so. It detailed the story. I got invested, and I did something I don't always normally do. I started clicking the links attached and reading more. I clicked the first link, which popped up a picture of the killer and his wife. I recognized them instantly. Both of them were my yoga students at a country club in Arizona. This was in 2019-ish. The living fourth wife attended every class of mine. 1 month prior, she told me her and her husband were abruptly leaving for the summer to attend to business. And that's how I found out my yoga student was an axe murderer through Reddit. Story 29. I fell onto a wild manatee when exiting a dingy backwards while on a snorkeling tour. It was surfacing right where I jumped off. I fell with my back onto its back and slid off into the water. It didn't seem to care at all. Story 30 was in a group of American and British military. One American mentioned having an assignment in London previously. A Brit, interest piqued, asked where he lived while there. They each kept describing a smaller and smaller area, to eventually learn the American had rented a house owned by that Brit. Story 31. The night before graduation, I'm sitting in a bar with my mom and a friend from school. She asks how we became friends, and I tell the story of how we bonded over each of us having a poster of the same obscure lefty folk singer. As soon as I finished the story, that obscure lefty folk singer walked into the bar. Story 32. You can't beat me with this one. Going to try to make the story short. Decades ago moved with my husband from Europe to US in a median-sized town. Got pregnant, went to a CA OB-GYN who was speaking my language. Found out he was from my country. Had a very complicated pregnancy, so my mother-in-law came from Europe to help us. When she heard my OB-GYN's name, she told me it was funny because when she was an anesthesiologist nurse, she worked with a doctor having the same name. Guess what? It was my OB-GYN. They had worked together in OR in a small-town hospital. As today, it still baffles me. Story 33. In my elementary school class, there were maybe 60 students. Of those 60, there were 5 sets of fraternal twins. All 5 sets were born in the same city within a 2-month stretch of 1981. And although it's a large city with a metro area population in the low millions, We all ended up at the same elementary school. It was such a normal part of life that none of us twins ever realized just how statistically unlikely it was until later in life when we started having friends from different schools and cities and countries. Oh, and it was Minneapolis, one of the Twin Cities and home of the Minnesota Twins. Honestly, we should have gotten a branding deal. Story 34. My puppy never had accidents or anything. At Thanksgiving, we had family in town and sitting on the floor, and mid-sentence he pooped in my lap. It was hilarious. Fast forward to next Thanksgiving, the family is back in town, and we were laughing about how he pooped in my lap last year, and mid-story he pooped in my lap again. I'll never live that down. It was like he started a new holiday tradition. Story 35. I was 16, smoking a blunt on my parents' balcony, and thinking about how Disney shows used to have shooting star episodes, or how Disney World would play that song When You Wish Upon a Star. I jokingly sang it out loud to myself, and I literally immediately saw a shooting star meteor shower / something similar. I was astounded. I just looked at the sky and smiled so hard that I forgot to make a wish. Story 36. As a kid, don't ask why, I once held a pair of trousers in a doorway as if an invisible person was wearing them. When I let go, they just stood there on their own. Obviously, I screamed for my mom and brother to come and look, which they did, but we did eventually have to move them because they were blocking all access to the kitchen. Annoyingly, this was in the days before everyone had a camera in their pocket, and my mom's digital camera was on the kitchen table. Story 37. I saw a little kid lose his fingers by falling on an escalator. He fell as he was jumping and the hands got stuck in the stairs mechanism. The mother's wails, the slap the dad gave the mother across the face. My colleagues rushing and looking for fingers, the blood everywhere. I was at work, whilst I completely froze. Now that I'm a mom myself, I'm traumatized of them and I hold my kids so tight and will not let him move when we have to take them. Story 38. When I was 10, I was eating breakfast and looking out a window at the street, and I saw a trailer with a boat on it dislodge from a truck, shoot across my front yard, crushing my mailbox in the process, and then into my neighbor's driveway and impale my neighbor's truck. Thankfully, no one was in it. Story 39. My brother flicked a cigarette butt, and it landed standing up. That was over 20 years ago, and still stands out as a WTF moment. Another time, I saw 4 jacks get beat by 4 aces at the casino playing poker, and that's a very, very low statistical probability I got $400 table share because it was a bad beat jackpot hand.